10. Puni Sticks. When America entered the Vietnam War, most of its soldiers weren't familiar with the concept of guerrilla warfare. More specifically, their definition of what it meant to win or lose a battle, and the methods for taking out enemies were vastly different from those of the Viet Cong. While the American mindset meant that a winner was the last one standing on the battlefield when all was said and done, the VC had no problem retreating from an active battle. In fact, it was an imperative part of their tactics for drawing US soldiers further into their territory and ambushing them. To aid in this strategy, they implemented an array of booby traps that were rigged to go off when activated by unsuspecting passerby, aiding the VC's efforts even in their absence. It's estimated that as many as 11% of deaths and 15% of wounds to US soldiers in Vietnam were caused by booby traps and landmines. As much as 2% of the wounds suffered by American soldiers during the Vietnam War were caused by sharpened rods called Puni Sticks, or stakes, typically made from bamboo and sometimes from metal. The simple yet ingenious devices were often planted in camouflaged pits by the Viet Cong, with the hopes that American troops would pass through and walk over them. For added effect, the North Vietnamese sometimes smeared the tips of the sticks with feces or plant poison. Unsuspecting soldiers stepped right into the holes, which were concealed by leaves and foliage, and were impaled by the rods. Puni sticks weren't meant to kill, but to cause excruciating pain and slow down advancing units as they stopped to tend to wounded soldiers. In most cases, the sticks penetrated the lower leg area. They were positioned in a way that typically made it impossible for an injured soldier to pull his leg away without causing further injury. And the concealed pits were often positioned side by side so that any soldiers who ran to the first injured troop's aid also fell and got hurt. Not only were the Puni sticks being placed in pits, they were put in tunnels and used with barbed wire. They were also often strategically placed in areas where the Viet Cong expected American forces to take cover during an ambush as a way to weaken their defense. 9. Hand grenade booby traps. The Viet Cong were masters when it came to booby traps, using a creative variety of materials and techniques to trip up the enemy. One of their most highly favored, tried-and-true methods of ensnaring American soldiers was through the use of strategically placed hand grenades. Oftentimes, the explosives were hidden along streams and at the bases of tunnels, with a string attaching them to a stake in the ground. All it took to trigger an explosion was an unsuspecting person to get caught on the tripwire. The Viet Cong also rigged pathways that were used by American soldiers by removing the safety pins from grenades and stuffing them inside cans, which kept the safety activated. They tied the bomb to a string and placed the explosives in a manner that pulled them out of the cans when someone stepped on the string, causing the safety to deactivate and the grenade to explode. The VC had other imaginative ways of hiding active grenades. When they gave up their position, they sometimes rigged their flag with an explosive, knowing that the Americans took great satisfaction in capturing enemy flags. You can probably guess what happened when US troops went to take the flag down. In these cases, the VC often set secondary booby traps and secondary delayed charges, so that anyone who rushed in to help the soldiers who were wounded in the first explosion would also get hurt. 8. Cartridge Trap. The Viet Cong favored cartridge traps because they were extremely difficult for Americans to detect, and they only required 4 basic parts that were easy to acquire: a bamboo tube, a piece of wood, a nail, and a small arms cartridge. They were also easy to assemble. The bamboo pipe was positioned upright and nailed in place on a wooden foundation. A nail that functioned as a firing pin was placed beneath the ammunition cartridge, and the trap was buried with the ammo round facing up. When someone stepped on it, the primer on the cartridge pressed down on the nail, causing the round to fire straight into the person's foot. Cartridge traps were typically non-fatal, but they caused severe injuries. And by aiming for the foot, the VC did a good job not only at pulling individual soldiers out of the game, but distracting entire sections of soldiers who would rush over to tend to the injured individual. For the VC, it created the perfect ambush opportunity. 7. Bamboo whip. In keeping with their impressive ability to come up with simple yet highly effective ways to sabotage the enemy, the Viet Cong made use of materials that were readily available. One of their most ingenious creations was the bamboo whip, or the whip trap. It involved setting a 3 to 10 foot long stalk of green bamboo with spikes attached to one end in an arched position against a tree with a catch device attached to a tripwire. The wire was laid across a path that the VC expected American soldiers to pass through. When activated, the catch released the spike-covered bamboo stalk, which in turn impaled the person who stepped on the tripwire. According to We Are the Mighty, bamboo whips could travel as fast as 100 miles per hour, giving the person in its path nowhere near enough time to get out of its way. It typically struck in the legs or torso, and it was definitely enough to put a soldier out of commission at the very least. Do you think you'd be able to avoid this during the war? Let me know in the comments, and hit subscribe while you're at it. 6. Faulty ammunition. The M16 is historically known for being an unreliable gun that's prone to jamming and a host of other malfunctions. But it became the standard issue gun for the US troops during the Vietnam War. Instead of focusing on improving it, however, the Americans were more concerned with sabotaging the enemy's Chinese-made AK-47 supply. In a covert campaign codenamed Project Eldest Son, Americans stole ammunition stashes from various hiding places throughout the wilderness. Technicians replaced the smokeless powder in the cartridge with a similar-looking but highly explosive substance that generated an enormous amount of pressure and caused the gun to explode upon firing. Troops replanted the deadly ammo in known stash pots throughout Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia, with the intention that unsuspecting enemy soldiers would use it and unknowingly blow themselves up. To disguise the cause of the impending blasts, the saboteurs mixed the rigged ammo with cartridges that had not been tampered with. A clandestine group of Green Berets, called the Studies and Observations Group, or SOG, were tasked with leaving the faulty supply with known guerrilla ammunition stashes. In some cases, operatives created new stashes in places where they predicted the ammunition might come in handy for the Viet Cong, and where it would make sense to think that a previous VC unit had left the stash, rather than enemy American forces. In most cases, the rifle components were projected backwards toward the shooter. Saboteurs also placed substitute fuses in the mortar shells. The results of firing an AK-47 with sabotaged ammo were typically catastrophic for the soldier who was unlucky enough to pull the trigger, and anyone nearby. Guns are unavoidably dangerous, but most people don't expect to pull the trigger and have the weapon blow up in their face. The main goal of Project Eldest Son was to make the enemy question the safety and reliability of their ordnance. To encourage this line of thinking, American operatives forged documents to spark mistrust between the gun manufacturers and the troops using the weapons. In some ways, the mission was very successful, but it was discovered before even half of the rigged ammunition had been placed, sparking a rushed effort to distribute the rest before the Vietnamese discovered the true reason their guns were malfunctioning. Even after they learned about the operation, it had the damaging effect of compromising the safety of their ammunition stashes in combat areas where the materials were most needed. 5. Mace Trap. One of the most commonly used and destructive devices used by the Viet Cong to sabotage the American adversaries was the mace trap, or the swinging mace. In simple terms, it involved suspending a 24-inch metal, concrete, or wooden ball, often weighing 40 pounds or more, and with spikes welded onto it in a tree. Like most of the other traps you'll hear about on today's list, it was attached to a tripwire. The unfortunate soul who tripped the wire would cause the ball to be released from its waiting position and right into their path, often striking in the head and torso. The swinging pendulum was known for its deadly capabilities, and some even considered it the worst of all the booby traps that were used during the Vietnam War. It often struck more than just one soldier, creating a two birds with one stone effect. 4. Tiger Trap. Like the mace trap, the tiger trap relied mostly on gravity to do its damage. Also known as a deadfall, it consisted of a large, spiked wooden board that was situated overhead and connected to a tripwire. The board was also weighted with bricks. When someone stepped on the wire, the board was released and simply fell on the soldier, often causing major injuries to their head and upper body. Because of its weight, the deadly piece fell hard and fast, ensuring that its target had little time to think before they were hit. And it most certainly was capable of killing whoever was in its path. 3. Venomous Snake traps. Included among the many sabotage methods the Viet Cong had up their sleeves was the use of pit vipers and highly venomous snakes. They carried the reptiles in their packs so that any Americans or other enemies who might search their belongings would risk being bitten. VC guerrilla fighters also tied snakes to bamboo tripwires and hid them throughout the tunnels, in hopes that the reptiles would bite American tunnel rats who ventured into the dark, narrow labyrinths. They called pit vipers three-step snakes, as a reference to the limited number of steps an American soldier would be able to take before being killed by the venom. Tunnel rats were specifically trained to identify and disarm these traps, but it didn't make the job any less dangerous. Earlier on in the war, the US Army struggled to come up with a way to destroy Viet Cong tunnel systems. Bombing was ineffective, and many of the tunnel networks were so large that efforts to smoke guerrilla fighters out or drive them out with tear gas often failed. At some point, the military realized that the only way to impose on the tunnels was to send soldiers inside of them. Entering the tunnels came with many dangers in addition to the possibility of encountering a booby trap. Poorly constructed tunnels sometimes collapsed, and the Viet Cong purposely built them so they were easy to flood, in case the need to drown a tunnel rat arose. In some cases, VC fighters attacked tunnel rats with poison gas. The subterranean pathways were also filled with dangerous creatures other than pit vipers, including disease-carrying rats, venomous scorpions, and ants. Due to the unavoidable dangers that came along with the job, tunnel rats suffered shockingly high casualty rates compared to many other units. In addition to the hazards of entering the tunnels, just being on the ground was dangerous for tunnel rats, due to the US military's use of Agent Orange and other dangerous chemicals. As a result, a high percentage of tunnel rats who survived the war have suffered from lifelong health complications due to Agent Orange exposure. 2. Hornet Trap. Hornet traps have been described as similar to, but less aggressive than snake traps. Given its self-explanatory name, not much of an explanation is needed. The Viet Cong set these traps by placing bee or hornet nests along a patrol route. They made especially clever use of Asian giant honeybees, which entomologists have described as the most ferocious stinging insect on Earth. The hive was linked to a small charge when someone unknowingly walked by and activated the trap. As you probably already know, it doesn't take much to anger a hive full of bees or hornets. In this case, the small charge took care of that part, releasing a plethora of hostile insects on entire groups of soldiers. On the American end of things, the US sponsored a program to create an apparatus that would spray VC guerrillas with the pheromone that attracts bee stings. As innovative as the concept was, it was never put to use. 1. Anti-helicopter booby traps. The use of helicopters was imperative to the American war effort in Vietnam. In addition to ferrying supplies to US military sites, choppers deposited troops into battle and evacuated injured soldiers away from the battle scene. Consequently, the Viet Cong devised ways to disable landing helicopters. One simple but highly effective method involved attaching mounting grenades, mortar rounds, and other explosive to trees surrounding a landing zone. Naturally, the devices were attached to tripwires, which were strung between poles that were inserted into the ground. The tripwires were activated by the landing aircraft, effectively grounding the helicopter. According to a Marine Corps report, the VC once tasked a teenage boy with positioning hand grenades at various chopper landing zones. He tied pieces of paper to strings that were wrapped around the grenade's levers. When a helicopter's rotor blades blew the paper, it pulled on the strings and triggered the grenades to explode. Thanks for watching. Which one of these traps would frighten you the most if you became stuck? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.